Okay, so tonight and Friday, we're going to go from Abraham to Jesus. So this is a very brief history of Israel, Judah, and Judea. And tonight's the first part. Friday will be the second part. We're going through the whole of the Old Testament, really. If you can see my Bible here, you can see this bit is the Old Testament, the New Testament. So there's a lot to get through, and this is really just sort of skimming over things. And we're starting with Abraham. Matthew's Gospel starts with the genealogies of Jesus, his family tree, basically, and Matthew started with Abraham. So if it's good enough for Matthew, I think it's good enough for me. And we're going to work through and have the highlights. A couple of basic principles for how I'm going to approach this. First of all, I'm interested in what happens where. All the countries and the names, it can be a bit confusing when you read the Bible, because a lot of the names are unfamiliar. We don't know the places. It's not like London or Paris or New York where we could find them. So we're going to look a bit at the geography, because that can be helpful in understanding and following what's going on. We're also going to look at what happens when in the life of any group of people. Big events have an impact, and we're living through one now with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so these big things which happen, they make a difference, and you see that at different stages in the Bible. So we're going through things in a sort of chronological order. And the other thing, the other principle really is, what's this got to do with us now, today, and what's it got to do with Jesus? People often tell you to read the Bible in a Christocentric way. Well, but what does that mean? And we also think, what has it got to do with the church in 2020? Because most of what we're talking about, all of what we're talking about happened at least 2,000 years ago. Some of it was more than 3,000 years ago. So it's a long time ago. So those are the sort of the guiding principles. Some things you'll know by the end of this week, not necessarily by the end of this talk, but by the end of Friday's talk. So you'll know what the name Israel means. You'll know the difference between Israel and Judah and Judea. Judea is spelt in two slightly different ways, but they're both the same. I use both. Also, you'll know why calling Jesus Son of David is a big deal. It's something we hear in some of the Gospels and we don't really think about, but it would have been a big deal to the people around Jesus. You'll know why the Samaritans were despised by the Jews. Why is it weird that Jesus talked to a Samaritan woman at the well, and why did he pick a Samaritan for the Good Samaritan? We'll also look at why, I don't know if any of you remember the Boney M song, By the Rivers of Babylon. That wouldn't have been an upbeat pop song for the Jews, more the opposite. We're also going to find out which figure in the Old Testament is described as a Messiah. I would be willing to put money on the fact that no one would guess it, but we'll see. I'm not actually putting money on it. I'm not that rich. We'll also find out why the New Testament is written in Greek, but the Old Testament exists in Hebrew and Greek. That still has certain implications today, even in 2020. And you'll also know where some of the important places are. So those are some of the things which you'll know by the end of Friday's session. Some of them you'll know by the end of tonight. Start moving swiftly on, because there's so much to get through. On this map, you can see some of the modern countries in the area we're talking about. obviously Israel, Syria, Iran, all these places have been inhabited for a really long time. It's good to remind ourselves that this isn't happening in a fairy tale. This is happening in real places. Let's go on to look at the next thing. You can see there's in ancient times there was something called the Fertile Crescent, which is kind of what the name suggests. It's an area where it was easy to live. Agriculture was easy. You could farm, you could grow food. It was a nice place to live. But you've got a big desert right there in the middle, and that stopped people going through it. So when people travel in the Old Testament, they're often traveling round through this Fertile Crescent. I probably should have included Egypt on the map. That was probably an oversight. Egypt is just off to the bottom left, and Israel, of course, is the coastal area on the left, as you can see here. So lots of people would go through Israel to go from Egypt to Mesopotamia. So you can see on this map, I've highlighted some of the ancient places. In green, you can see Mesopotamia. This is this region with lots of very ancient cities. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Some of the ancient cities are still around today. Jerusalem and Damascus, both are still cities now. People live there. Nineveh, Babylon, they've gone now, but they were both important in the past. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and Babylon was the capital of the Babylonian Empire, both of which we'll meet again later on. And finally, I've also noted Ur, which we'll talk about in a second with Abraham. But you can just see where some of the biblical places are in relation to the modern world. A lot of Iraq and Syria, as well as modern day Israel. So with that quick sort of geography lesson behind us, we're going to go on to Abraham. Abraham was not in any sense an Israelite or a Jew. He came before them. He's the forefather of them all. And he came from this city called Ur. And Ur was in Mesopotamia, which is this very sort of sophisticated region. Even 3,000 years ago, already before that, it had a long history of cities. So he grew up in a place with orchards. They had good agriculture, good farming, and we find that he leaves Ur and he goes with his family. He goes with his father and his brother. His wife Sarah comes with him. His brother's wife comes as well. It's a family sort of trip, and they go to a place called Haran, which you can see on the map. I think Haran was still relatively civilized, if you like. And they get to Haran, and there Abraham's father dies. Bit of a turning point in his life. Just the other geography thing, Canaan, what becomes the promised land, that's a pretty frontier area at this stage. It's not like the big, nice sort of civilized cities with temples and theatres and, you know, amenities. It's a sort of a fairly rough area at this stage. And if you read some of the stories of Abraham, you see it's quite sort of terribly easy life. But the other thing to say about Abraham is that he's not a young man when this happens. He's 75 years old, which is not the age when you tend to sort of start out on new journeys. and his wife is a similar age. And we've gone past the bit in the Bible where people are living hundreds of years, like Methuselah. So 75 might be a slight exaggeration, but certainly he's not a young, spunky 25-year-old who wants to go off and be a pioneer. He's definitely a mature man. Probably an older man. I tend to take the 75 fairly literally. Let's go back for a sec. So at Haran, God speaks to Abraham, and this is what he says. Oops. So the Lord said to Abram, God changes his name. I'm going to just call him Abraham tonight, it's easier. Says, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you I will curse. And by you all the families of the earth shall bless themselves. So Abraham, probably a bit taken aback when he got this, I should think. There isn't really any indication in the story that he knew God particularly. It seems like he's not sort of said to be a priest or anything like that. God isn't yet his God personally. That God hasn't yet chosen a nation at this stage. So Abraham was probably a little taken aback, and especially because he was an older man, and at his age he wouldn't be expecting to father a great nation, because the implication in all of this, making him a great nation, is that he's going to have children. And obviously his wife was the same age. It wasn't as if he had married a 20-year-old. So the chances of that happening must seem quite remote. And to top it all off, God's sending him, away from the land he knows, away from sort of civilization. Egypt is probably, for Abraham, coming from where he comes from, is potentially a bit of a hostile country. I think it's not necessarily a lot of love lost between his area and Egypt in this time. So Christians talk about Abraham as our father in faith, and that's a sort of an easy thing to sort of say. But really, when you look at Abraham's situation, when God says this to him, and Abraham goes, "Okay, I'll do it," and he takes his family and he goes off on his travels. And Abraham really was a man of faith, because we tend to be impatient as human beings, and we hope that things will happen quickly. Abraham has to wait 24 years before his son Isaac is born, so that he's 99 when Isaac is born. That's a pretty long wait for God to come through on his promises. And I think there's a good lesson in the spiritual life for us there, because all of us are impatient, and perhaps especially in 2020, when we live in a world of Zoom and tech stuff, we can click a button and order things and it arrives at our door the next day. But God very much has his own time span. He does things when he thinks it's right, and Abraham must have had his moments when he wondered what God was doing, and over those 24 years. So I think there's a good lesson, it's a good spiritual lesson for us in looking at Abraham. He's the father of the spiritual father and the literal father of everyone who comes after him in this, which we're going to look at. So we're going to leave Abraham now, and we're going to also jump over his son Isaac, and we're going to go on to Isaac's son Jacob. lots of stories about Jacob. The one I'm going to talk about tonight is when Jacob wrestles with God. You might know this as Jacob wrestling with an angel. I think if you, partly perhaps artists and later thinkers are responsible for this. But in a second, I'll read you the story, and it's really God. Nonetheless, it's a lovely Rembrandt picture. So I'll just read you quickly the story of Jacob wrestling with an angel. Jacob is on his own at this point. We shan't worry why for now. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and Jacob's thigh was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no more be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Tell me, I pray, your name." He said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his thigh. So again, kind of the edited highlights here, but and there's so much we could say about that story. I think it's fascinating that Jacob meets this man who he then discovers is God, and obviously what do? You wrestle with him, you fight him. That says quite a lot about Jacob, I think. Again, I think it says something about how humans approach God. But what I want to dwell on is this change of name. Your name shall no more be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Israel means striving with God. And you can see that, as you'll see in the history we go through, the Israelites and the Jews often have a rather turbulent relationship with God. It's not always easy, but God doesn't let them go. He always holds on to them, even when it's difficult. And I think that's one thing which the Rembrandt picture actually captures. Even though it's an angel, you can see he's holding Jacob, almost as if he doesn't want to let him go. And when I say that the Israelites and the Jews had a slightly turbulent relationship with God, I don't intend that to be a criticism of them at all. I know when I look at my own life over the years and still today, I sometimes feel like I'm struggling with God. And God probably must be rolling his eyes at times and think, "My goodness, Eddie, can't you just, go with this instead of fighting me on all these things?" And I think if we probably look at ourselves, we probably see a similar thing in our own lives. So I think in that way, Jacob, Israel, is an example of human nature. The other thing about Jacob, Israel, is he has 12 sons. And they give their names to the 12 tribes of Israel, which we'll come to in a second. But when you read the Psalms or the Bible, you're hearing about Israel. Remember that, first of all, Israel is a person, and then it becomes eventually a nation. Leaving Jacob or Israel behind and moving to the crossing of the Red Sea and the Exodus story, you probably all know a bit about Joseph going to Egypt, and then Moses in Egypt, and Pharaoh and the plagues, and the crossing of the Red Sea. we're going to come back to that when we look at how the first Christians read the Old Testament. The whole Exodus story is such a big deal that it really deserved its own space. And I think it's interesting to look at from the point of view of the first Christians. So I'm going to skate over it tonight. I'm also going to really kind of skate over Moses, although he's a really big figure in Judaism and the whole law of Moses. The only thing I want to really say about Moses and the Ten Commandments is that because a lot of the Ten Commandments start with "thou shalt not," we've kind of got this idea that they're there to restrict people. But when you think about the situation where God gave them to the Israelites, they'd just escaped from Egypt. They weren't a people, they were fugitives on the run. They didn't have a society. And God gives them these commandments to help them live together. And a lot of them are a pretty low bar. You know, don't kill, don't commit adultery, honor your father and mother. It's not asking a great deal in many ways. And actually, in some ways, God gives them a gift when he gives them the instruction to keep the Sabbath, but he's giving them a day off. And that's not, we're used to the idea of having a day of rest, having a day off. Although in 2020, Sunday is less of a day off than it once was. Lots of people work nowadays, but the idea of the Sabbath, the idea of stopping work, that doesn't exist in any of the other cultures of the time. They just keep working through and eventually get a break. God is giving, instructing them to take a day of rest, so that they can spend time with him, but also so that they can recuperate. And perhaps that's something which we don't fully appreciate. You know, the Sabbath commandment is a big commandment still for Jews today. So that's the only real thing I'm going to say about Moses and the Ten Commandments and the law. You're really getting the helicopter view. On to Joshua and the Promised Land. Moses doesn't manage to get to the Promised Land. He unfortunately dies. So a man called Joshua leads the Israelites into the Promised Land, and he defeats the inhabitants, the Canaanites, and they take over. One interesting thing to mention about Joshua is that it's actually the same name as Jesus, Yeshua in Hebrew. Jesus isn't a common name in English, although it is in Spain, in Spanish-speaking countries. But Jesus and Joshua have the same name. And you might already spot a parallel. In the Old Testament, Joshua leads the Israelites into the Promised Land. Jesus is the one who leads us to heaven. You can see a certain parallel there, which we'll come back to next week, but it's perhaps worth mentioning now. The other thing just to sort of to say is that Israel is still really a set of tribes at this point. All of Jacob's sons have a tribe. Actually, Benjamin's sons actually, Manasseh and Ephraim, become two separate tribes. Levi, Jacob's son, his descendants become the priests. So the Levites, the sons of Levi, don't get their own territory. They get cities. They get tithes from the rest of the Israelites instead of territory. But if you look at the tribes of Israel, most of them are the sons of Jacob. Most of them are named after the sons of Jacob, including Judah, which you're going to hear a lot about tonight, and especially on Friday, actually. So Judah starts off as just one of the tribes of Israel. And this might be a good point to say that they still have quite a few enemies. This isn't a peaceful time. It's quite a dangerous time, as you see there's quite a lot of battles in the Old Testament. The Philistines you've probably heard of, but the tribes of Amalek, Edom, and Moab were sort of also great enemies of the Israelites, and you quite often sort of come across those names in the Psalms. And they're people who, they're the bad guys most of the time, with a few exceptions. So we have the conquest of the Holy Land. It's a great victory. You hear about the fall of Jericho, the walls tumbling down, and if you're interested, you can read in great detail about how the tribes divide up everything. But we'll go on now to Judges and pass over this fairly quickly. The Judges are basically war leaders, and then you get Saul, who's the first king, and there's a lot of conflict with the Philistines. You might know the story of Samson. Has an affair with a lady called Delilah, kills a lot of Philistines with the draw of a donkey, an ass. That's a turbulent time. We're going to kind of again skate over that a little bit, but just say that it's chaotic, and the Israelites are so unhappy that they want a king like other nations. Samuel, who's sort of a prophet and also the last of the judges, the rulers, is he's not happy about this, and he sort of speaks to God, and God says to him, "It's not you they've rejected me from ruling over them." So for Israel, a human king's not the natural order. They're meant to have God as their king. God has established a covenant with an agreement with Abraham, again with Moses when he gives the 10 Commandments. God is meant to be their king. They shouldn't need anybody but God. They're supposed just to rely on him. And that's something else which I suppose we see again in our own lives, and the lives of the church. We shouldn't perhaps need natural things, but we do. We should just be able to rely on God, but we struggle with that. Anyway, God meets the Israelites halfway and says, "You can have a king." He does warn them about the drawbacks to having a king. The king's going to tax you. He's going to make you fight in his wars. It's not going to be easy. But things have been so bad with the judges and the Philistines attacking that the Israelites are willing to go for this. So they get the first king, and the first king is Saul. Saul's from the tribe of Benjamin, and he doesn't really rule over much beyond the tribe of Benjamin. But there is somebody who comes along under his rule, and that's David. David and Saul have a bit of a difficult relationship. David plays the harp and calms Saul. You read the story of Saul, it sounds like he was probably a bit depressive, but David playing the harp sort of soothed him. That didn't stop Saul trying to kill David on numerous occasions, and David, to his credit, doesn't kill Saul even when he has the opportunity to do so. David is one of the really big figures in the history of Israel. You probably don't need me to say what's in the picture, but of course it's David as a boy fighting Goliath. Goliath and the Philistines are a sort of representative of the sort of historical dangers they faced. There's also the sense in which you see in the New Testament God saying that he takes what is weak and despised. Paul says, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. And this is a story that really sort of captures that very vividly. The boy David, he's only got a sling. He's up against a veteran warrior with sword and armor. And it's God who wins the victory. It's God working through David who wins the victory. And David, a bit like Abraham, is not a perfect character. Or Jacob come to that. They're not perfect people in the Old Testament. They're often quite flawed. You hear about David's affair with Bathsheba, which is one of the most disreputable episodes in the Bible. But he's still a man who God works through, even despite David's weaknesses, and on at least some occasions moral. But David is the man who makes Israel into a kingdom, and you can see here the map which the kingdom he rules. He's actually the first person to capture Jerusalem. The Israelites never had Jerusalem until David captured it, and he takes the Ark of the Covenant there eventually, and so it starts to become a holy city from this time onwards. But you can see in red the names of the peoples that he defeated: Edom, Moab, the Ammon, the Arameans, the different tribes. So David really sort of forges Israel into a nation, and he's remembered as a war leader. And so when you think about calling Jesus the Son of David, especially in an occupied country, which the Romans were occupying Judea at the time of Jesus, you're making that's a bit of a political statement. The other thing which you can see in this picture, David is credited with writing a lot of the Psalms, playing on his harp. And so David is this sort of spiritual figure, and the Psalms are the treasury of prayer in the Old Testament. Monks, nuns, priests, and some lay people pray them every day when they do morning prayer, evening prayer. They're a great way to pray the Bible. Just briefly to dwell on the son of David then. If you're identifying Jesus as the son of David, then that's a claim for kingship, and we'll see why in a minute. We've had two covenants. We've had a covenant with Abraham where he promises to make Abraham's descendants into a great nation, and that sort of started with David. We haven't really talked about the covenant with Moses and Sinai, but that did happen too. With David, we get another covenant, which another stage in the relationship between God and his people. So here we are. This is the covenant. So moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. So the first part's a bit like the promise to Abraham. It's sort of about offspring, children. And he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. When he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. So his house, his dynasty, is going to be is going to be a kingdom forever. And God's saying that he's going to be the father of this house, which is a that's a bold statement. You know, you don't normally think of God as father. We're used to saying the Our Father, but that's not something you can really take for granted with God. And he promises that he's not going, even if he has to discipline his son, he's not going to remove his love from him. And then the last part, in your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. So it's not going to be a passing thing. It's there forever. That's God's promise. And so when you get to the time of Jesus, David's kingdom has disappeared, and his dynasty seems to have disappeared. But we see when this is applied to Jesus, when Jesus talks about coming with a kingdom and is called Son of David, you can begin to see why some people thought that perhaps there was going to be a political uprising. Maybe Jesus would kick out the Romans and be a new King David. If you think about some of this slightly different way, you can see sort of, well, Jesus is chastened by the rod of men, and he is the Son of God. So early Christians, looking ahead a little bit to next week, read this in a sort of a way which looked at Jesus as going through it, as it referring to Jesus. Briefly on, because we took a minute or two to start, a few minutes to get started, and I try not to run too long. David's son Solomon takes over. He's famed for being wise. Perhaps beyond his wisdom, though, the really important thing he does is he builds the first temple. You might be able to see the Ark of the Covenant in there, just between the two winged creatures. The temple is important. That's the place where people offer sacrifice. On the right, you can see the fire, and there's a priest standing there. There were lots of sacrifices in ancient Israel and ancient Judah. Those things were important. They were usually animal sacrifices. And I'm sure you know, we have the sacrifice of the Mass. We talk about Christ sacrificing himself, Christ as the paschal victim. All of that comes down, it develops out of this. And the idea of having a holy place to worship God, whereas before the Israelites moved around in tent, and God won't allow David to build him a house. Only when it gets to Solomon. After Solomon's death, unfortunately, the kingdom splits up. His sons don't do his son doesn't do a terribly good job of ruling. So you get the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. We'll perhaps talk about this a bit more on Friday, because I think it'd be good to get some questions in. But just to move on, so that's the end of part one for tonight. We'll move on to the questions in a second. Thank you to Marissa, Amy, and Becky, who've done the help with the hosting and some of the technical setup things. Without them, it wouldn't be the way it has been. So thank you very much.